horrible slap, wasn't it? Yeah. It's like, no. It's one of those things where, pretty much in a sad sort of way, it sort of validates what we've all been through, and it was real, and it was progressive, and it wasn't our fault, and etc. I mean, it's sort of a gruesome way to get validation, but, it's like, it's amazing, what validation does, especially for the inner child. It's like, oh, I wasn't imagining all that stuff. Like, I wish I had been imagining it. So, yeah.
I wish I was just being a big old baby the whole time, but really wasn't that.
Yeah. So, anyway, that's really the of all the ones that we do, that's pretty much the toughest one. So, this one's kind of tough, but in a sense, it's kind of like, we can make it kind of fun. Well, I'm going to try to make it fun. There's some irony to it. Okay, so definitions of codependency. So way back, so codependency is one of those conditions, I guess was one way of saying it, that it's gone through a bunch of evolutions, and as much as we've tried to get it into the diagnostic manual, it's not there. We can't get it into the diagnostic manual, so it's not a disorder according to the diagnostic manual. And there's kind of reasons for that, and some of them I think are valid, some of them I think are not, and we'll get into that a little bit as we go through this. But so really codependency comes out of the alcohol treatment modality, which is really dramatically separate from the medical model. So the medical model, for the most part, is set up as observing, symptoms so that you can come up with a diagnosis of a disease, and then you come up with a treatment plan that the doctor administers, and then you get better. Right? So you break your arm, right? All right. You're not in charge of the healing. So, but with all this internal stuff, you have to be in charge of the healing, right? So the medical model is useful in the sense that it is really good at being able to take the diagnostic model. Here's a bunch of symptoms, they seem to be pointing to this condition, and this condition sort of says you do this as a treatment plan and you get better. So I don't have a problem with that. It's like a nice scientific way of identifying stuff, and that's the medical model, right? The recovery model is more, I don't know, it's like more inside out. It's like I discover within myself what works to stay clean and sober, for example. And then, so you go back to, when the 12 steps were developed, way back in the 1920s. And if you actually, this is something for you to research if you're, want to, but if you kind of read about how that whole thing sort of evolved, and one of the weird things about it, was the inclusion, William James, Carl Jung, there was like this influence coming in from, the psychodynamic people, the spiritual people basically. There was this influence that came in that really, they sort of see Carl Jung as the godfather of AA, actually. He's sort of seen that way. Because he was one of the ones that said this needs to be, and it's in so you have the 12 steps and you have the 12 traditions. They're kind of two separate things. I mean, you work the steps, you follow the traditions. So but one of the, in the traditions, it talks about This is a program of attraction, not promotion. I mean, that's totally spiritual thinking. You do not promote AA. You know, you attract by walking the talk, right? So it's like it has that kind of orientation. It's grounded in spirituality. It sort of sees addictions as spiritual diseases in the sense that I made a bottle or whiskey or a relationship or gambling. I made this my higher power. It's a false god. So it's a violation of the first commandment. So the first 3 steps are all about getting a higher power. Because that's the instead of agenda. Like, I gotta let go of this as my higher power and get a real higher power, you know, and then I got a chance, you know, of having a life and healing and all the rest of it. So it's a different orientation when you look at the recovery model, so to speak. So in the 1920s then, they started on this journey. You know, the big book came out, whenever it came out, the thing that kept evolving. So in the 1950s, the women, you know, it was women primarily. I mean, if you look at AA, it works. It was developed by middle-aged white guys, and it works really well for middle-aged white guys. It's linear, it's step by step, and you get rewards. You know, works great. It works really great for, you know, like, you know, professional white men, you know, middle-aged, you know, so it works great. You know, women and minorities and people that are more horizontal, you know, it doesn't work quite as well, but it can be made to work, right? So a lot of people of color or a lot of women, you know, are in AA and it works for them. But really it was designed for middle-aged white men. You know, so it is not,
So did it take over that position as model for, instead of being substance, it became the model?
and then the model sort of, when I was gonna suggest, if you wanna get into this in depth, look at the Canadian model, like
Okay.
especially in the Yukon and BC, because back in, like, it was in the 60s is when they tried to take the Western, you know, the medical model into Barrow. You know, and they were using the medical model, they weren't using AA, they were using the medical model into Barrow. It blew up, you know, it was just a complete train wreck. And so, and then it got written up in all the journals, and so it was in, you know, somewhere, Whitehorse or somewhere, like in the, you know, over in Canada, they started playing around with a different model that was a community-based model. It wasn't an anonymous model, you know, with confidentiality and all that kind of stuff you have with the medical model, but they did a community-based model. And they were getting, pretty quickly, they were getting better results than, you know, than anybody was. You know, there was non-recidivism rate, you know, kept going up. The problem with it was, it was a community-based model, but essentially it sort of replicated native tribal practices. You know, so you got the elders and you got community support, and boom, you know, it's like, you know, it kind of lifts people, you know, in a way, supports people in a way, you know, that they're going to get better. You know, and that model works really well, and it's totally different, you know, than the medical model or, you know, the recovery model. Where it overlaps, but where it overlaps is the meetings. You know, it's like in Anchorage, there's 200 AA meetings a week. You know, and so the community part of it is that's the overlap. The spiritual part, that's the overlap. You know, the elder part, you know, like the sponsoring is like elders, that's the overlap. You know, so there's whatever. So in any event, 50s, the women were going, wait a minute, we need to do something about us, you know, people that are stuck with alcoholic spouses. You know, it's like we got it. So anyway, Al-Anon was the result of that. So Al-Anon is for partners of alcoholics. And that basically began in the 1950s. And it accelerated pretty quickly, because it was building on, 30 years of research already. And so it built really pretty quickly, and by 1970, it's like within 15, 20 years, Alateen came along. So what Alateen is a program within Al-Anon that is specifically for the teenagers growing up in an alcoholic family system. So that whole sort of family systems thrust, came out of Al-Anon. Right, so that's 1970. So back up to the 1960s, that's when transactional analysis was sort of the fad, pop fad, for pop psychology fad that was going on. And so transactional analysis had its roots in humanistic psychology, which then evolved into like positive psychology and whatever. So it was here for a while, it was a flash in the pan kind of thing, but then the gains that came from it transferred, and then got fleshed out later on. So in transactional analysis, they used the idea of the transaction was between the child, the adult, the child, the adult, and then sort of the critic, the critical adult, whatever. And so the transaction was between or among these different elements of the self, right? And so there's a bunch of different ways that they played around with that, right? So who's talking right now, or who needs what right now? It's like when you check and you go, oh, my child is who's talking right now, or whatever. So that was like one of the things that transactional analysis sort of hit in the 60s, and then the inner child stuff came out of that, as you can kind of see, right? So what also came out of it is what we're going to work with next week is the rescue triangle. That showed up. Eric Byrne was the guy that did a lot of the transactional analysis. I'm Okay, You're Okay was his major book, and it's still pretty relevant. It's pretty easy to read too. It's not like a textbook, but and then then the games people play was another one that came out of it. And the games alcoholics play is where the rescue triangle showed up. And the rescue triangle actually showed up earlier in the 50s, again with the Al-Anon thing. So in Al-Anon sort of language, they started with the word enabler. And so what an enabler does is the enabler enables the alcoholic to maintain their addiction. So they call in for when they're hungover and they can't go to work, then you call in sick for them. It's like you've got the flu, right? So you find their booze and pour it down the drain. You do all that kind of stuff. You clean up after them. You take responsibility for all the consequences of the alcoholism. Like I'm going to run interference and clean up before or after the fact, and make sure that they don't suffer the consequences of their alcoholism. Right now, why would you do that? Well, you're 17, female, don't have a high school diploma, 2 kids, no job skills. Cliche, right? But if my husband loses his job, I'm screwed. So 100% of the time, the reason behind enabling was legitimate, and if somebody comes in and says, this is my situation, what do I do? Well, let him suffer the consequences of his behavior, well, then he'll lose his job, and then my kids will starve to death. You go, oh, well, what do I do with that? Or, the one that's really sort of, kind of tugs at your heartstrings is like, the mother, whose, 19-year-old son, is, hooked on Oxy or something. What do I do? Well, let him hit bottom, and then he'll get clean and sober. Or die. One or the other. How do you do that one? So the enabler identified, you know, it's like, so Al-Anon is about helping people not be enablers anymore, you know, and then find out creative ways of making sure that the addict or the alcoholic suffer the natural consequences of their behavior without it making things worse somehow. Right, that was sort of the equation they were trying to solve for, which is easier said than done, and you really got to get creative. You know, so, but what happened, addicts being addicts, with the enabler identified, they go, well, I wouldn't be an alcoholic if you weren't enabling me, it's all your fault. So a little blaming the victim, huh? So we'll run into our friend blaming the victim quite a bit. You know, it sort of shows up, you know, as kind of a generic problem, you know, at every step of the damn way we go. So we went, okay, well, let's change this term because it looks like the term enabler has become pejorative. So we need a new term. So we came up with co-alcoholic. So this sort of put the focus back where it belongs, in the alcoholic. You know, and I ended up being in this relationship with you, you're the alcoholic, and I'm trying to make this work. And oddly enough, I'm in a trap where I'm going to be a co-alcoholic, because oftentimes what, you know, co-alcoholics end up being alcoholics. You know, let's go screw it, you know, might as well all party, you know, and, you know, call it good for, you know, this week or something. So, you know, so that one actually worked a lot better, at least in terms of not letting the alcoholics get off scot-free with, you know, blaming the victim. But we began then, this is like, you know, past, you know, 50s, 60s, we're into the 70s now, we began to see, you know, that this co-behavior, co-alcoholic behavior, got generic. You know, it's like it wasn't just the alcoholic family system. It was literally any dysfunctional family system had this kind of behavior going on. So then we got into, okay, how do you define an alcoholic, or how do you define a dysfunctional system? And that one still gets bandied about. We still argue over this. And probably every description that you get on what defines, you know, a dysfunctional system, each one of them, I'm probably not going to disagree with that definition. You know, it's a pretty broad topic, and you can define it in a bunch of different ways. So I'm going to define it in, you know, in a way that kind of works for specifically what we're going to be doing today, you know, and if you come up with better definitions, you know, just kind of look at it and go, oh, it's that too, you know, right? So this isn't exclusive, this isn't the only definition. Oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to be the one that only had I have the right answers. No. So, what defines an alcoholic family system or any dysfunctional family system is when there is a competing focus. Okay, so, alright, so you've got, you know, the like mom and dad, so let's sort of do this. You got mom and dad, and then you got like all the little kiddies, you know, down here. Right? So these guys are equal, right? So the power is equal, and these guys are all one down. Okay? So that's normal. I mean, that's the way it should be. Alright, so if there is alcohol, now it's like the alcohol creates a competing focus. So I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, you know, then I'm over here, you know, in love with my alcohol. The wife's competing, the children are competing. So now it's like we've created like a hierarchy. So I'm up here with the alcohol, everybody else is competing against it. And in that competition, you've created the dysfunctional system. Because it's competitive, it's fear-based, and it's fundamentally shame-based. because I'm going to be putting everybody down to win, because competition means winning and losing. So I have to win. And the only person that's safe in this system is the winner, is the king of the mountain. This was like, I'm safe because I'm at the top of the mountain. I've won all the conflicts, or won all the whatever, and I'm here. So everybody else is not safe, but I am safe, and that's cool, because I can stay safely up here, you know, and get drunk, and blame everybody else for the consequences. So the competing focus is what we figured out, was that's what creates the dysfunctional system. So the competing focus can be all kinds of stuff. It can be, we define 3 different categories of addiction, and it's like, so there's substance abuse, you know, so I'm abusing, you know, alcohol or drugs. You know, there's what we call process addictions, and those would be like gambling. Sex addiction would be a process addiction, you know, but you know what I'm saying? So gaming is now one that's coming, you know, like online. Hey, that's cool. I couldn't help it though. Okay, and then relationship would be the third addiction. Okay, so we'll get to competing focus here, you know, like with relationship stuff in a bit, you know, just sort of see that in a healthy relationship is a give and take that goes on. In a dysfunctional relationship, I made you my higher power. How could that go wrong? Yeah, we'll get to that later. So, so what happened there was the co-alcoholic term became, in a sense, obsolete. So that's when we finally came up with codependent. Codependent, right? So a codependent is going to be this person, you know, that's in the one down position in that competition. You know, they're competing against the alcohol, they're competing against the drugs, they're competing against work, they're competing against whatever the hell, religion, that's another good one. They're competing against it, and they're losing the competition more often than they're winning. And so a manipulation then begins, you know, to try to get that person to get clean and sober or whatever. You know, it's like, so there's this, I need to make them, I need to get them. And so there's a bunch of different mythologies that go with it. The main mythology, and this is one all of us that grew up in dysfunctional family systems, all of us grew up with this myth. I have the power to make you see. You don't. You know, how many times do you, I can just get them to see X, Y, Z, then everything would be fine. I mean, how many times have you caught yourself saying that in your own head? You know, like a couple billion? And when ever has that ever worked out? It happens all the time in soap operas. You know, it's like they usually have this at the end of, you know, like some scene. Oh, I see. It happens in the movies. It never happens in real life. You know, so you can't get anybody to see anything. The seals lead the horse to water. You can't make them drink. Problem. All right, we got this. Yes, we got this. Okay, good. So. So that's the start of what we're talking about with codependency. So to use like this family model, you know, that I started with over here, we have it set up as there is the dependent, there is the codependent, right? This is mom and dad typically. Then the kids get thrown into what we call survival roles. And the survival roles are family hero, scapegoat, lost child, mascot. Okay, so these are the major survival roles that we see. There's minor ones, and I'm going to cover a couple of them because I see them all the time. But these are the major ones, and I see these more frequently actually. But So, alright, so when we're talking the definitions of codependency, it's like, so I learned how to be a codependent by growing up in an alcoholic dysfunctional system and by playing one of these roles. That taught me the codependent way of being in the world. That's where I learned it. So kind of knowing, like where this whole thing came from is important, because if you're going to dismantle it, this is what you have to dismantle. Because this is sort of your key into that lock. This is your entrance into the game. It's like whichever of these survival roles, were that you adopted as a child. Right. So what am I talking about with survival role? Why is it a survival role? So I kind of touched on this briefly last week, but let me go over it again because I'm going to highlight it in a different sort of way. So in all of us that grew up in dysfunctional systems, there was that moment when you're like somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. Remember, we talked about this at the end of last week. Somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, you recognize that you're in a system where your parents are crazy. They don't know how to take care of you. They aren't even an adult yet. Themselves. Like they're nuts. And they're alcoholics or they're addicts or they're this or they're that. And it's like, oh my God. It's like I have to figure out how to survive. Here's the point, right? I have to figure out how to survive in this system. In other words, expecting to be taken care of is off the table. I'm going to have to find out a way to either take care of myself or manipulate the system so that they're forced to take care of me somewhere, in some way, shape, or form. That's what this is going to be. So that's part of the survival part, and if I act, what makes it even worse, if I ever let my light shine, like little children that you see them when they're just completely uninhibited, there's this light that shines. There are these beautiful expressions of the universe. They are children of God. You can see it. There's this brilliance that this comes inside out. So there's this light that shines from within. And that light that shines from within is what will get them killed. Because when somebody broken, wounded, addict, alcoholic, sees that light, it reminds them of their own darkness. It reminds them of their own failure. And guess who suffers because of that? The kid. How dare you shine this light and mirror back to me my own, my own dysfunction, whatever, my own damage. So bam, they get smacked. So 1, 2, I gotta survive a crazy system. 3, I gotta come up with a survival role. So what we have then, where we have this set up, there is this core event, when you recognize what I just said. Now you kind of don't recognize it in the way I'm saying it, because you're like somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. So at about age 6, I talked about age 4 is when you have an I sense, like an I am, it's like I am separate, I am an individual, mind. Okay, so I have finally I've got the ability, the mental ability, I've individuated enough that there's a me. By age 6, this is when Maslow talks about belongingness needs emerging. So belongingness needs, what that means to this I, this now here, I have to figure out the rules of the game that I'm in and the roles that I can play so that I fit in. So in psychology, we call that the rule, role, ego. It goes from age 6 to about age 10 or 11. And then it changes. So the rule, role, ego is what kicks in. So I realize I'm screwed. All right, so we go back to this. So then, so I have this core event. So then I recognize, okay, I gotta figure out how to make this whole full-time work. Okay, first I gotta hide my light under a bushel to go directly against what Jesus told us to do. Yes, hide your light under a bushel or you're gonna die. And then I gotta figure out, it's like how to stay alive. Well, first thing I gotta do is justify the abuse, to justify the abandonment, to justify the neglect, to justify whatever it is that's going on that shouldn't be going on. I need to justify it in order to survive. Because if I protest it, like I don't deserve this, they'll kill me. Somehow you sort of feel that or know that. So I come up with what we call a core belief. So your core belief is negative in some way, shape, or form, because that justifies the abuse. So I'm not okay. And you beat me up, you're my parent, you beat me up, like I can justify it. Well, of course they beat me up because I'm not okay. If I was okay, they wouldn't beat me up. So it's pretty, in a sense, it's kind of genius on the part of you, the 5-year-old. I mean, it's fairly genius that you're figuring this stuff out back then and outsmarting your dysfunctional parents. So it's really kind of cool. So you come up with a core belief, and the core belief is some form of I'm not okay. It's some form of that. So now you gotta way to, in a sense, protect yourself from the abuse, or at least justify it. So now then you have to figure out a game plan to sort of get you through your childhood. And so the game plan sort of has pieces to it. And we call it a survival system. All right, I'm going to give you mine because then you'll have something really to go with. So my core belief is I'm not okay because I'm not enough. Like whatever it is, I ain't enough of it. So that's my core belief. So what I'm trying to do at some level is prove to somebody I am enough, and then I'll get out of jail. But I can't let myself prove it because then I don't have a way to justify the abuse. Yeah, I know, it's like, I know, this gets weird and complicated and convoluted, and I'm saying, this is the genius of you as a 5-year-old. I mean, you figured this shit out at 5 years old. I mean, I didn't figure it out in the logical way that I'm presenting it, but you figured it out. It's like you figured out in a behavioral way how to protect yourself. It was brilliant. It was genius. So I'm going to be proving I'm okay, making sure I don't prove it. So what we start with over here is hope. So I have hope. In order to stay in the system, I have to have hope. Otherwise I just kill myself. So if I'm a better little boy, here's how I do it. If I'm a better little boy, then Dad will quit drinking. So then, of course, he doesn't quit drinking. So I come to acceptance, and I mean that in the AA sense of the term of acceptance. Acceptance is I'm telling the truth, right? So I accept I'm an alcoholic, right? So acceptance, I'm just telling the truth. It's not a surrender. It's not a caving in. Acceptance is a real dynamic. I accept, I claim, this particular truth. So Dad won't quit drinking, bastard. So what this does, it sort of releases your true self, which is hiding underneath this core belief. Like what this is doing is it's suppressing and pushing down and into your unconscious. The true self doesn't get to ever come out. I can't let the light come out, right? So the true self is being repressed by this core belief. No, I'm not okay. Stay down here. So here it comes out. Whoop, and guess what it comes out feeling? Yeah, like anger, betrayal, fear. No wonder we repressed it, right? Wow. So it comes like growling out of your unconscious. And so as a result of that, of course, you're going to act out. Yeehaw! And that'll go on for a while. And what happens then, you get caught. And in getting caught and punished and yada yada yada, a couple things happen. One, you've reinforced the core belief. Yep, there's more evidence that I'm not okay and my true self needs to be repressed. Right, so you've reinforced the core belief. But additionally, you justified the abuse. You know, you basically made it okay. It's like, oh, this abuse is really okay, I deserved it. Right? So it kind of gets the abuser off the hook. You know, so it protects the abuser. But if I try harder, then maybe I'll quit drinking. So I've got a way to get through my childhood. I just keep running this pattern over and over and over again. You know, variations on it, you know, but essentially I ran this particular pattern from, you know, probably, you know, it was probably by the time I was 6, you know, it's like I had this pattern figured out. I know by 7, you know, I would consistently cry myself to sleep when I was 7 years old. That was like a consistent theme, you know, because everything was so screwed. You know, by 8, I was starting to figure out how to really play this game and manipulate the system, right? You know, so I just got better at it. Got it? Last week was screwed. I'm going to erase this, it's too depressing. So, the way it goes, pretend like it didn't happen. You know, it's going to denial. Alright, so that being said, each of these, we're going to call them archetypes. You know, they're patterns, you know, they're ways of being in the world, you know, like in Carl Jung's way of looking at things, like that's what an archetype is. It's like a file folder of behaviors with a little thing on top of it, and this is the little title on top of the file folder. So if we look at what's in the file folder for each of these, you know, that's one of the things that we're going to play around with. So the dependent alcoholic addict, you know, the codependent, you know, the person that basically does the enabling. All right, so those are the archetypal sort of pieces that they're going to be doing, and there's different ways, there's different stuff in those file folders. All right, so we can go into that if you want, but what I'm going to go for really is these, you know, like family hero, scapegoat, lost child, mascot. So those are the ones that would have to unravel, you know, to get like the healing process, you know, engaged. This is, in a sense, know your enemy. This is the enemy we need to know so we can defeat it. Okay, so, like Pogo said, we met the enemy and he is us. Or we are him, or whatever he said, I can't remember. Alright, family hero. So, family hero is usually, it's the first child or the first female child. Alright, so with situations where it's an only child, oftentimes that's what the only child ends up being a family hero with none of the other ones, you know, really applying. And they can apply, but it's like, you know, it's usually they're stuck in family hero, at least for a while. Sometimes when they're teenagers, they end up in scapegoat. But what is the family hero's job in the alcoholic system? So if you think about the alcoholic system as the system itself functions as a denial system. so that the alcoholism can proceed, unimpeded. So what's going to happen is everybody that's in this system supports the denial system. Like there's nothing going on. We're fine. We didn't do it. You did it. Yeah, so it's sort of like our politics these days. It's like, it's like creates a denial system, and then each of us in the system has a role within the denial system to make sure everything stays cool. So the family hero's job then in that system is to essentially be a hero. Straight A's from school. Like this was my role. I was the oldest of 5, and so I had straight A's in school. A football hero. Get it? It's like, so all of this, I had like this high sort of profile job, of making sure that I got it all right. I was number 1. I was like, always at the top of whatever. It's like I was hard charging, super responsible. When I ended up, doing, taking care of my brothers and sister, co-parenting. It's like I was my mother's confidant, when she was upset with, my dad, all that kind of stuff, right? So that was kind of the family hero role. Make sense? Okay.
So did the world reward you for that role? Did you find validation of
No.
yourself out in the world?
No, I mean that's like the problem with each of these roles, and we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit. It's like I'm gonna get all these accolades, but it's not for me. The true self is not present. Yeah, the role is present. And so this stripped down part of who I am, gets all these accolades. I remember I was talking to one of my nieces a few years ago, and I was down in California visiting, and for whatever reason, and this one day, I ended up with 3 of my nieces. They were all like teenagers, and we were just sitting in, I don't know what was going on, I don't remember why. It was me, these 3 nieces, sitting in this living room at my brother's house, and my brother's the alcoholic. So we were sitting there, and we were talking about this kind of stuff. They were asking me about it, so I turned to one of my nieces and I said, so you're basically the family hero. And she goes, yeah, probably. And I says, so any of the cool stuff and awards and everything that you got, she was like a high level soccer player, like all city, all state soccer player. And she got all these awards and whatever, championships and stuff that she got. Says, have you ever felt rewarded? Has any of this actually been you that felt it? She goes, not once.
Wow, what an artist.
Yeah. The thing was, what was cool about it, I mean, it was kind of a bummer, but she recognized when I said it out loud, she recognized it. She goes, oh my God, never have I felt me being rewarded. It was always this false front that was out here, and the real me was back here hiding. And I just sort of went, that's fucked up, isn't it? Yep. So, do you need a hug? A little group hug of me and my 3 nieces. Right? So, yeah, so it's a very serious role. You just do not have, any time to play or have fun or any of that. None of it. It's like you're always on task. You're always like looking for the next thing that needs to be taken care of. Because if it ain't taken care of, I mean, in my experience, if one of my brothers or sisters got into trouble, they got beat for getting in trouble. I got beat for letting them get into trouble. Yeah, that was SOP, and so you're always on task. You're always like paying attention. You're always making sure everybody's doing what they need to be doing, and so of course you've lost your childhood as a result. Yeah, so that's just, I mean, each one of these lost, you're gonna lose your childhood regardless. So this is how I lost my childhood with that, like being hyper-vigilant about anything to make sure it got fixed so that we wouldn't get beat or whatever. Got it? Okay, that's family hero. Scapegoat. What does the scapegoat do for the family system? Yeah, they're like a pressure relief valve, right? Because bad things are happening all the time. You know, mom and dad are screaming and yelling at each other, kids are getting beat. You're walking on eggshells. I mean, it's not a happy place to be. So there needs to be a pressure relief valve, and that's what the scapegoat is. Right? It sort of takes on all the negative energy. In a sense, the family hero takes on all the positive energy, so that when the second child shows up, you know, and they can't get any of the positive energy because it would dilute the energy. So they get the negative energy, typically. So these two are almost always going to be present, you know, in an alcoholic family system. These two, not so much. They'll show up, you know, like less frequently, but these two are almost always you find them. And even with, like I was saying earlier, even with an only child, they'll sort of bounce back and forth between family hero and scapegoat. You know, so because there has to be that pressure relief valve, right? So they'll pick up all the negative energy, and so the kind of the cool part about, because I ended up being a scapegoat when I was 16. So I switched with one of my brothers, and I just found scapegoat to be way more fun because you just got to be a bad boy, you know? Go out and drink and chase women and get into trouble and get caught shoplifting and go to jail, and I mean, it was get into fights all the time, you know, pick fights all the time. Great. It was like way more fun, you know, like being a scapegoat. I mean, in the sort of obnoxious sort of, because I didn't have to like worry about getting it right anymore. You know, now my brother did. Then he went off to Vietnam and got, you know, a Bronze Star, Purple Heart, a couple of them, and Agent Orange poisoning and PTSD. You know, but he was perfect. He was a hero. You know, he did. You know, he came back a hero. You know, and he was a hero during that period of time after I switched. You know, with him at 12 or at 16. So it's the thing that we found with, you know, the whole scapegoat role is that it's one of those ones that sooner or later you're going to run into the system, usually sooner rather than later. And so if you really look at alcohol treatment counselors, you know, you get a little of their family history, about 75% of them were such scapegoats. Yeah. You know, they got caught, they got put into treatment, you know, as teenagers, they kind of got it. You know, and then as they sort of got older, you know, and, you know, they ended up going on, basically, you know, they got into 12-step programs, and the 12th step is to help other alcoholics, right? And so, you know, they ended up, you know, going into the trade, into the profession. So you'll find a lot of like social workers, alcoholic treatment counselors, you know, it's like or former scapegoats, bad boys. You know, like when I've got to get continuing education units for my license. And when I ended up going over to the local place that does alcohol treatment counselor trainings. That's usually where I go to get my CEU credits because they're so much more fun to play with. This is all these bad boys, you know, it's like, and bad girls, you know, that's like, you know, they're still like, got that edge, you know, to them. They're just so much fun to be in training with, way more fun than, you know, psychologists and psychiatrists, you know, they sit around with suits and ties on, being boring, or serious or something, but yeah. Imagine, I ended up in the back row a couple of years ago with this guy. You know, he's in Narcotics Anonymous. He's like this black gangbanger, you know, and still wears his hat sideways and tattoos and, you know, and the strut. And we were sitting in the back row, just like giving the poor instructor this the hard way to go. Bruce, we gotta quit doing this. And I go, why? We've had so much fun. Okay, scapegoat. I recommend it, no? Way more fun than I know. It's like way more fun than Family Hero. Just the one that, yeah, you end up dead with this one, that's the downside of it. So, you're getting into trouble, right? Okay. Lost child. This is the one that, okay, so think of it from the child's point of view. You show up in this highly structured dysfunctional system, all the positive attention is already accounted for with the family hero. All the negative attention is accounted for with the scapegoat. How are you gonna fit in, right? This is the problem, I gotta find a way to fit in. How are you gonna fit in? Well, I don't know, I don't think I do fit in, so I'm just gonna disappear. Go over the back fence. That's the lost child, they basically disappear, right? And I mean it like literally in that sense, where you're gonna go over the fence, you're gonna play with the neighbors, you end up, being, you spend more time having dinner with the Mexican kids on the other side of the fence than you do at home. I mean, you end up, like, not around, it's like you just, like, whenever anything's happening, it's like you find a way to just disappear. So, the lost child is one of the ones that we really worry about when you run into them in counseling, because they're high risk for suicide, because they got no grounding. They're not, it's like if you're an energy person, they're not grounded. When they walk into the room and you just sort of shift and feel where they're at, you go, oh wow, they're not grounded at all. In other words, they're not committed to being on planet Earth. They haven't committed to be here. It's like, I'm still not sure I want to be here. It's like I survived till 25, 30 years old, but I'm still tentative about staying on planet Earth because it's pretty fucked up. It's like crazy people and crazy world. And okay, so they're really not grounded. So they're high risk for suicide. And because they're so secretive and going over the fence and all the rest of it, as children or as, like teenagers or young adults, they're at real high risk for sexual abuse, or getting kidnapped and, sent someplace for, a sex slave trade or something. So exploitation and whatnot, there's high incident of that with this population, this lost child population. So, and then they kind of just check out if that happens, and then check out even more. Like now I'm not only not grounded, to Mother Earth in my own experience, I don't even want to stay in my body because it's not safe to be in my body. So they're kind of dissociated all the time. It's just like a really, minimal existence. As a result, they tend to be pretty retarded in terms of developmental stuff. Like they're not developmentally on task. I mean, they're not really here. They didn't really get the training they need to be, adults. They're really not developmentally developed. So the result is kind of hard, to be able to talk to them. And usually they end up, their addiction usually kicked in 12, 13, 14. So when addiction starts, development ends. And so they're really sort of primitive, egos, yeah. So this is really a tough one, to deal with. And again, it's like in group settings, they disappear. In an individual setting, they disappear by distracting you to talk about yourself. So, yeah, because they figured out somewhere along the line, you get people to talk about themselves, they don't focus on you. Because everybody's an egomaniac anyway. Want to hear about me? Let me tell you the story! I'm so wonderful. And boom, they're not there. So this is one of the trickiest ones we work with, because they're so slippery and so not here, so not committed to the planet, and so they make for a really interesting, situation. Years ago, I was at one of the conferences where I ended up going where there was a bunch of psychologists and stuff. And it was when the DSM-5 came out. and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, right? And this a few years ago it came out, and so they made some major changes in diagnostic procedures with the DSM-5, and so somebody came out from DC that was one of the authors of the DSM, and she did this day-long workshop over at the Denina Center, and there was probably, I don't know, 150, 200 counselor types, you know, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, social workers. We showed up, she did this day-long presentation. What are the changes? What does it mean to you? Blah, 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 right? So I figured I needed to know that stuff. So I went to it. And so the first part of it, she got into, all the changes and why and all the rest of it. And then in the afternoon, what she did was she had people read like a case history of a client, and then we diagnosed it. And they were really complex cases, they were pretty challenging cases. And so the third one, the person was, read the case history, this person, blah, 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 blah. And I'm going, wow, that sure sounds like a lost child to me. And so, I raised my hand and I asked more questions. Well, is this also happening? Is this also happening? I'd asked like 3 or 4 questions about to clarify the symptoms. And then, it confirmed for me lost child, right? So then we're all done. And so then they said, okay, so what should the diagnosis be for this person? So I raised my hand and I said, well, if this is what I'm seeing is the lost child, I got alcohol treatment, and until you deal with the lost child piece, nothing else will work. Well, then the shitstorm began. Wait a minute, cognitive behavioral therapy will work. Yeah, as soon as you deal with lost child, it will. But it ended up being this knockdown, drag out fight, between my point of view, which is not, it's my point of view, obviously, but it represents this recovery model point of view, competing with the medical model. So anyway, after this, if I just sat down and shut up, because I don't want everybody yelling at me, and we got all done, and we broke for coffee or bathroom break or something. And so one of the other counselors I know, she came over and said, Bruce, way to go, you're keeping everybody on their toes. No, fuck you. but anyway, the woman that was her client, she came up to me and said, you nailed it. Why didn't you say that to the whole group? Yeah.
They're reluctant, it seems like, at that higher level of psychology. They're reluctant to call it a spiritual issue.
Well, yeah, and it's like, well, it's in this case, it wasn't so much spiritual, it was the recovery model. Mm. And they started to see the recovery model, because what's a diagnosis anyway but a snapshot? Yeah. Boom. Whereas lost child is a dynamic. It's more, it's a role that's dynamic. And so, it's back apples and oranges. So in a sense, we were both right. Where it is that I disagreed was, what do you do first? And for me, if you don't deal with lost child, then nothing's going to work. If you don't get them grounded in their reality, if you don't get them back in their body, if you don't get them committed to their own life, nothing will work. Seems kind of obvious to me. Whatever. So, all right, mascot. What do you think? You notice these are all roles that are, the label is pretty descriptive. So the mascot does what for the family system?
Lightens everybody know?
Comic relief, absolutely. Lampshade on the head, "Yee-haw!" Slapstick humor. It's like, so we got comic relief. Now we got everybody's happy. So again, it's like the one I was telling you about all his nieces I was telling you about a minute ago, my brother the alcoholic. This was him, who's a mascot, and he never got out of that role. He's pretty much, still like drinking and partying like he was 25. Yeah, so, immature, they stay immature. They really never get out of adolescence. And so they're just sort of stuck there. I don't see this one much because they typically don't get into recovery. There's no real reason to. They just keep bouncing, through life, like a little bouncing ball, for music. And so it's again, it's really a tough one. Because they have to kind of get it together and get serious about something, and who wants to do that? Okay, so a couple of things about this then. So let's say the cops show up. The cops show up for, I'm gonna break here in a minute, I can turn the heater on. I'll turn that one on too. That's kind of a nice one, I like that one.
I don't know how to get it to run now.
It'll click on,
Okay.
maybe. But, one of the things that'll happen is the cops show up because there's been a domestic violence call, like the neighbors heard parents arguing and they call the cops and they show up and do a safety check or a domestic violence call out. And so, it's like, what happened? Well, if I'm a scapegoat, I'm gonna claim responsibility. So I'll get the cops and say, "What are you doing here?" I'll make it about me. And the mascot's gonna help me. These two work together to protect, like, the perimeter. It's not all that bad. So it's me, I'm the bad guy, right? So, yeah, so they'll work together. So it's kind of interesting how things will work, like, dynamically. Okay, gotcha. So these are the major roles one you run into. Now, the minor roles, there's a whole bunch of minor roles that have been identified. There's two that I run into fairly frequently, and both of them are tied to sexual abuse. So, what one of them for women, and I see this with women, the other one I see for men. For the women, I pretty much see what we call the chameleon. And for the guys, I see jack of all trades. Okay, so chameleon, it's in the word, right? So chameleon, basically what I'm saying to the world is I'll be whatever you need me to be. You can see how this would fit with sexual abuse, right? Yeah, some girl in a sexually abusive system, I gotta, survival-wise, I gotta be what you need me to be in order to survive. Makes sense, right? When we get this in recovery, the recovery process, it's like, okay, who do you want to be? I mean, you know how to be everything else, you know how to be yourself, right? So that's one of the tacks, that I'm going to take. I'm going to sort of transform, have you transform. I'm going to be whatever you need me to be. Well, I need you to be you. Who is that? Let's do it that way. So that's kind of how that works. Jack of all trades, guys, I will do whatever it is that you need me to do. So I'm going to go fix everything. You need me to fix your feelings. It's like, I'll do that. It's like, so again, boys that are sexually abused, I gotta do what I need to do to survive, right? So it's the difference there is being and doing. You can argue there's not really that much difference, but I see that difference as a crucial element in the recovery process. So, being and doing, right? So, one leads to the other. So, got that? Makes sense, right? Pretty straightforward. Yeah. That's always kind of fun, you know, when you get somebody comes in and they start running, they ask you, it's like, what do you need me to be? Right, so that when they're like have a client, a female client, and she's trying to figure out what she needs to be in my office. Sorry, you know, so you're gonna have to be yourself. But that's not safe. Was not safe out there, it's safe in here. So let's see who that person is. Well, I hate that person because it's not okay. Okay, so that's what are we talking about when we're talking about our definitions? These are our definitions. Codependency includes, you know, all of these topics, so to speak. And you can see why it's not in the DSM, right? How do you figure out diagnoses using all this kind of stuff? You can't snapshot stuff with this. This is much more dynamic, yeah.
You can't then include those two models, how do
Yeah, it's a different model. I mean, the other problem they have with it is that, like, enabling, you know, I'm gonna take care of you. So what's healthy taken care of and what's enabling taken care of, you know, so they can't, you know, the medical people can't really define that very well. So, anyway, enough of it. Okay, break time. We'll turn on the heater and make it warmer in here.
Opioid crisis. So the opioid crisis was started by bad healing, bad help.